The oxygen concentrator's steady hum filled the silence. A sound I had grown so used to it felt like part of the room itself. My father, Edward Blake, was resting or trying to, in the hospital bed we'd set up in the middle of his living room. His once broad shoulders were frail, his hands shaking as he tried to sip water. He hated the dependency, but cancer was merciless, stealing more from him each day. I sat by his side, a mug of cold coffee forgotten in my hand. His eyes fluttered open, catching mine. He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "You've got to take a break, James," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You look worse than I do." I chuckled softly, though it came out hollow. "Don't think that's possible, Dad." The corner of his mouth twitched, and I knew he wanted to retort, but the effort seemed too much. I reached over to adjust his blanket, a gesture that had become second nature in the past few months. My life had shrunk down to this room, this moment, this fight against something neither of us could beat. It was just the two of us now. Sarah, my wife of 6 years, had left 3 months ago. She didn't even say goodbye in person. I found a note on the kitchen counter one morning. "James, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." Her timing couldn't have been worse. I wanted to hate her for it, but I couldn't. There were moments, especially on those long nights when my father's pain was too great for either of us to sleep, that I understood. Sarah didn't sign up for this version of me, the version that rarely showered, never left the house, and had no energy for anything beyond keeping my dad alive. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. Another message from work. Another meeting I was supposed to be in. I ignored it. My career had been the first casualty of this battle. Promotions, raises, goals. All of it fell away as my father's needs took precedence. A small part of me missed the version of myself who cared about those things, but most of me didn't have the luxury to dwell on it. "James," Dad said again, this time stronger. I leaned closer, startled by the determination in his voice. "Promise me something. Anything," I said without hesitation. "When I'm gone, don't stay stuck. Live your life. Don't waste it." His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, it felt like he wasn't the one fading away. "I promise," I said, though my chest tightened as the words left my mouth. Living felt impossible to imagine without him. 2 weeks later, I stood at his graveside, the promise still ringing in my ears. The small crowd of mourners had dwindled. Most of the attendees were neighbors or people from his church, all with stories of how kind and dependable he'd been. My dad was good at that, being there for people even when they didn't ask. I stayed behind after everyone else left, staring at the fresh mound of earth, feeling more alone than I ever had. I spent the next few weeks buried in the minutiae of closing his estate. His modest house, his car, his accounts, nothing surprising. My father was a man of simple means and fewer indulgences. The reading of his will was scheduled for the following Friday, and I expected it to be a formality. I was his only child, after all. The lawyer's office was cramped but comfortable, with worn leather chairs and shelves lined with law books that looked more decorative than functional. Mr. Davenport, the family lawyer, greeted me with a firm handshake and a somber smile. "I'm sorry for your loss, James. Your father was a remarkable man." "Thank you," I said, unsure what else to add. We sat, and he opened a folder with meticulous care. "Your father left everything to you as expected, but there are additional assets we need to discuss." I frowned. "Additional assets?" He nodded. "Your father had investments, significant ones. Stocks, bonds, real estate holdings. There's also a trust fund he established when you were a child. With accrued interest, it's considerable." "How considerable?" I asked, still not processing what he was saying. Mr. Davenport handed me a list, his expression calm but watchful. I scanned the document, my breath catching as I reached the total. It wasn't just considerable, it was life-changing. "This can't be right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My dad was a mechanic. Where did this come from?" "Your father was also an investor," Mr. Davenport said gently. "A very good one. He made strategic choices and lived modestly to ensure these funds would grow. He wanted you to have opportunities he never did. My mind raced, but no answers came. My dad never talked about money beyond making sure bills were paid. I left the office in a daze, clutching the documents that declared me a millionaire. It didn't feel real, and it didn't feel like mine. The news spread quickly. In our small town, gossip traveled faster than wildfire. Old acquaintances reached out, some with genuine condolences, others with thinly veiled curiosity about my newfound wealth. And then there was Sarah. Her text came late one evening. "James, I heard about your dad. I'm so sorry. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my emotions a tangled mess. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. I hadn't heard from her in months, not since the day she walked out. My thumb hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed back. "What do you want, Sarah?" Her reply was almost immediate. "I want to apologize. I made a mistake leaving. Can we meet?" I didn't trust her, but part of me needed to hear her out. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was the ghost of who we used to be. I agreed to meet her at the diner where we used to go for breakfast on lazy Saturdays. When I walked in, she was already there, sitting in our old booth. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. "James," she said, standing as I approached. "Sarah," I replied, keeping my voice neutral as I slid into the seat across from her. For a moment, we just looked at each other. She looked like the Sarah I remembered, but there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry for everything." I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "I know I left when you needed me most," she said, her voice trembling. "I was scared, James. Scared of losing myself in the weight of everything. But leaving you was the worst mistake I've ever made." Her words were the apology I had wanted for months, but they didn't land the way I thought they would. Instead of relief, I felt a hollow ache. "Why now?" I asked. "Why not 6 months ago?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "Because I heard about your dad," she admitted, "and about the inheritance. It made me realize how much I lost when I walked away." I leaned back, the ache hardening into something sharper. "You lost me long before you heard about the money, Sarah." Her expression crumpled, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of clarity. Whatever we had before was gone, and no amount of apologies would bring it back. Leaving the diner that night, I felt an odd sense of weightlessness. Sarah's apology hung in the air like smoke after a fire, visible but insubstantial. I hadn't yelled or argued. I'd simply told her the truth. Whatever bond we once had was broken, and no amount of regret could mend it. Yet, as I walked to my car under the dim glow of streetlights, a deeper question gnawed at me. What did I want now? The next few weeks passed in a haze of paperwork and memories. My father's estate was more complex than I had imagined, with investments scattered across companies and properties in places I'd never heard of. As I delved deeper into his financial life, I found myself stumbling across pieces of his personal life I had never known. One morning, while sorting through a box of his belongings, I found a leather-bound journal buried beneath old photos and fishing gear. The first page was dated nearly 25 years ago, the handwriting firm and deliberate. I wasn't sure why I hesitated before opening it. Perhaps part of me feared what I might find, but curiosity won out and I flipped to the first entry. "James is almost 5 now. He's the best thing I've ever done. But God, I'm terrified I'll screw it up. I see my father's face every time I look in the mirror, hear his voice in every mistake I make. I want James to have a better life than I did, a life where he never doubts that he's loved. I just hope I'm strong enough to give him that." I set the journal down, overwhelmed by the raw honesty of his words. My father had always seemed so steady, so unshakable. It never occurred to me that he might have wrestled with the same insecurities that plagued me. Flipping through the pages, I found more entries, each one offering a glimpse into his thoughts and fears. He wrote about my mother, their struggles to make ends meet, and his dreams of creating a safety net for me. One entry, dated the year my mother passed, stopped me cold. Margaret reached out again. She said she'd heard about Lucy and wanted to offer her condolences. I shouldn't have picked up the phone. Hearing her voice after all these years, it stirred things I thought I'd buried. But this isn't about me. James needs me now more than ever, and I can't let anything distract me from that. Margaret. The name was unfamiliar, but the way he wrote it made it clear she had been significant. My father had loved my mother deeply, of that I had no doubt, but Margaret was a piece of his life I had never known. There were more mentions of her scattered throughout the journal, cryptic notes about phone calls and letters, about choices he made for my sake. I found myself compelled to know more. A quick search of his files revealed an address book tucked into the back of a drawer. Her name was there, scrawled next to a Boston address. For days I debated reaching out. What would I even say? "Hi, I'm Edward Blake's son. Did you know he loved you?" It felt absurd, yet the curiosity burned too brightly to ignore. When I finally called, a soft-spoken woman answered. "Hello. Hi." I began, my voice shaking. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is James Blake. I believe you knew my father, Edward Blake." There was a pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Edward," she said quietly. "Yes, I knew him. Is everything okay?" "He passed away a few weeks ago," I said, the words feeling heavier than I expected. "I found some of his writings, and your name came up. I thought you might want to know." Her silence was long and contemplative, and for a moment, I worried I had overstepped. But then she spoke, her voice tinged with sadness. "Thank you for calling. He was a good man. If you'd like, I'd be happy to meet and share what I can about him." We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Boston. I spent the drive rehearsing what I might say, but nothing seemed adequate. When I arrived, Margaret was already waiting. She was older than I expected, her auburn hair streaked with silver, but her eyes held a warmth that put me at ease. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," she said with a small smile as I joined her at the table. "Neither was I admitted, grateful for her light tone. For the next hour, she told me stories about my father. Stories I had never heard before. They met in their 20s, long before he married my mother. "We were complicated," she said, her smile bittersweet. "We loved each other, but we were young and foolish. When he met Lucy, I knew he'd found what he needed. Still, we stayed in touch, even if only through the occasional letter." She showed me one of those letters, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. In it, my father wrote about me, about how proud he was when I graduated college, about how much he worried he wasn't doing enough. "He adored you," Margaret said. "Every decision he made was for you." I left that meeting with a new perspective on my father. A man who wasn't perfect, who had his secrets and regrets, but who loved deeply and sacrificed more than I would ever know. Back home, I stared at the journals and letters scattered across my desk, my mind racing. My father's story wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about choices, about the balance between duty and desire. I wondered if he ever regretted the life he chose, or if he found peace in knowing he had done his best for me. As I mulled over these questions, a text from Sarah lit up my phone. "I miss you, James. Can we try again?" I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and began researching community organizations. My father had built a legacy of quiet generosity, and I wanted to honor that. His house, my childhood home, was still standing, a small but sturdy structure on the edge of town. I began to imagine what it could become. A space for people in need, a place of hope and connection. The idea took root, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of purpose. My father had given me the tools to build something lasting, and I intended to use them. Sarah's words echoed faintly in my mind, but they were drowned out by the sound of something new: possibility. The community center opened on a gray Saturday morning, the kind of day my father would have called good weather for reflection. The house I grew up in was unrecognizable, transformed from a modest home into a vibrant space painted in warm colors, with flower beds lining the walkway. Inside, the living room where I had spent countless evenings was now a reception area filled with flyers about job training programs, free clinics, and support groups. The kitchen, once dominated by the smell of my dad's famous chili, had been converted into a food pantry. People from all walks of life filled the space that day. Neighbors, volunteers, and families looking for a little help. Some came to give, others came to receive. But every single one of them, in some way, reminded me of my father. He would have loved this. I moved quietly through the crowd, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. I'd poured months into this project, and yet it felt like my father's hand had guided every decision. In his journals, he'd written about wanting to make a difference in the world, but he'd never had the time or resources. Now, through me, his dream had become a reality. "Hey, James." Emily's voice pulled me from my thoughts. She stood by the door to the kitchen, a smile on her face and a clipboard in her hand. "We're running low on diapers. Do you want me to run to the store?" Emily had been one of the first volunteers to sign up when I announced the project. She was an artist, always covered in a light layer of paint, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She taught art classes at the center on Wednesdays, giving kids a creative outlet they couldn't find anywhere else. Over time, she'd become more than a volunteer. She was a friend, a partner in this crazy venture, and, lately, someone I found myself thinking about more often than I expected. "Yeah, that'd be great," I said, handing her the petty cash envelope. "Take what you need." As she walked away, I caught myself smiling. For the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't forced. Later that evening, after the center had quieted and the last volunteer had gone home, I sat alone in what used to be my dad's bedroom. The walls were bare now, the furniture replaced with shelves of donated clothing. I thought about all the lives this place might touch. People finding a meal when they had none, kids discovering their talent for painting, parents getting a second chance to stand on their feet. Felt right, like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. My phone buzzed in my pocket, interrupting the silence. It was Sarah again. Her messages had become less frequent, but they still came every now and then. Short, heartfelt notes about missing me, about hoping I'd reconsider. I read this one slowly. I saw the article about the center. "It's incredible what you're doing, James. I'm proud of you." I stared at the words, my chest tightening. For a long time, I'd been angry at Sarah, and part of me still was. But anger was exhausting, and I didn't want to carry it anymore. I thought about my father's journals, his struggles to balance love and responsibility, and the choices he made that defined his life. Sarah had made her choice, and so had I. It was time to let go. I typed a response. "Thank you, Sarah. I hope you're doing well. Take care." The message felt final, a clean break that left me lighter somehow. I didn't need her validation anymore. I didn't need her to come back. I was finally moving forward. Over the next few months, life settled into a new rhythm. The community center flourished, and so did my relationship with Emily. It started slowly, long conversations after classes, late-night brainstorming sessions about new programs for the center. She had a way of seeing the world that made me believe in its goodness again, even when it felt impossible. One evening, after a particularly chaotic day at the center, we sat on the front steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Emily handed me a cup of coffee, her paint-streaked hands brushing against mine. "So, what's next, Mr. Visionary?" she teased. I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm just trying to keep up. This place is already more than I ever imagined." She looked at me for a moment, her expression softening. "Your dad would be so proud, James." The words hit me in a way I hadn't expected, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Instead, I reached for her hand, holding it lightly in mine. "Thank you," I said finally, "for everything." In her eyes, I saw the kind of connection I hadn't realized I was missing. Something honest and grounding, like finding solid ground after years of treading water. The days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The community center became a cornerstone of the town, a place where people found not just resources but hope. I found myself thriving in a way I never had before, surrounded by people who believed in what we were building. Emily and I grew closer, though neither of us rushed to define what we were. There was a quiet understanding between us, an unspoken agreement to let things unfold naturally. It was a kind of patience I hadn't known I was capable of, and it felt good. One evening, as we locked up the center together, she turned to me with a mischievous grin. "So, I heard there's an empty lot next to the center. What do you think about turning it into a community garden?" I laughed, shaking my head. "You're relentless. You know that?" She shrugged, her grin widening. "You like it." She wasn't wrong. As I stood there, watching her animatedly describe her vision for the garden, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. My life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was full of purpose, of connection, of people who made every day worth living. My father's legacy wasn't just the money he left behind. It was the lesson he'd spent his life teaching me. That love and sacrifice were two sides of the same coin, and that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to live fully, bravely, and without regret. Thank you for watching. What would you do in James's place? Share your thoughts and explore more gripping stories on our channel.